The sky burned like a wounded beast as Evan Cole moved through the shattered outpost, the air thick with smoke and the metallic taste of fear, every step echoing with the weight of a war he never asked for, but could never walk away from. He pushed aside broken beams with his armored shoulder, calling out for survivors, listening for any breath or whisper that proved life was still fighting beneath all this ruin. The ground trembled with distant explosions, but he did not stop. He could not stop, because somewhere in this chaos was a signal, a distress beacon coded in a frequency humans were never meant to hear. Yet somehow he heard it as clearly as a heartbeat pressed against his ear. He followed the faint rhythm through a corridor collapsed by enemy artillery, forcing his way through glowing dust and broken glass, until he saw her, lying half-buried under a fallen support beam, her silver hair scattered like threads of moonlight across the scorched floor, faint lines of bioluminescent glyphs glowing across her blue skin, in a pattern he had never seen before. It was Princess Sailory of the Lyran Empire, the very heart of a civilization that wanted nothing to do with humans except to keep them far away. Bound by ancient law and colder beliefs, yet she was here alive but hurt, and Evan's breath caught as he knelt beside her. Her eyes fluttered open, soft and shining like liquid crystal, and for a moment she looked at him not with hatred or fear, but with a strange, quiet confusion, as if she was trying to understand why a human was close enough to touch her. In her culture, even a single accidental touch between royalty and an outsider was a violation of sacred law, a crime that demanded purification or exile. But there was no time to think about that. The outpost shuddered again as enemy engines roared overhead, dust falling around them like dying snowflakes, and Evan leaned in without hesitation, sliding his arms beneath her to lift the beam just enough to pull her free. The moment his hands touched her skin, something changed in the air. Sailory inhaled sharply as the glyphs along her arms and neck pulsed brighter, shifting from soft turquoise to blazing gold, her heartbeat quickening against his chest as he lifted her. He felt a strange warmth rise around them like a silent wave, something biological, something ancient, something he could not name. She stared at him with widening eyes, whispering a single trembling word in her language that his helmet struggled to translate. The closest match was Omen, and it made no sense to him. But the fear in her voice did. Alarms wailed as Lyran officers rushed into the ruined hall, their sleek white armor glowing under the cracked ceiling, weapons raised at Evan the instant they saw him holding their princess. They shouted legal codes and ceremonial orders, demanding he release her, demanding they perform the purification, demanding the human obey a law he barely understood. But Sailory's hand tightened weakly at his armor, her breathing uneven as the glowing glyphs moved like living light across her skin. Evan sensed she was overwhelmed, not by pain but by something deeper, something tied to him, something she never expected to feel. A second explosion ripped through the far wall, showering the hall with fire and debris. The officers scattered for cover, and Evan acted before doubt could slow him. He lifted Sailory higher and ran through the smoke toward the evac corridor, her head resting against his shoulder as the glowing patterns responded again to his nearness. He felt the heat of them through his armor, a sensation he knew wasn't ordinary. Her voice came again, fragile but urgent, warning him that his scent was triggering a rare reaction her people called the resonance, a biological signal tied to royal selection, sacred bonds, and fate, something forbidden to happen with any outsider, especially a human. He didn't know what any of it meant, not yet, but he knew the panic in her eyes when she looked at the officers chasing them. He knew the fear in her voice when she whispered that the law would call him a corrupter, even though he had only tried to save her. He knew that handing her back right now would mean losing her forever to a punishment she did not deserve. So he kept running, pushing through the collapsing corridor, sparks raining down as pipes burst overhead and fires licked the walls, his heart pounding with a mix of adrenaline and a strange protective pull he couldn't explain. He reached the landing pad as enemy artillery screamed across the sky, scorching the metal under his boots. His dropship hovered shakily, its pilot shouting for him to hurry. He stepped onto the ramp, still holding Sailory securely, her glyphs flickering like a fading constellation, and for a brief second she looked up at him as if searching for something in his face, something she never expected to find in a human. He didn't speak, he didn't need to. His resolve was written in every breath he took, in every step he carried her through the fire, in every instinct that told him he could not let her fall into the hands of those who feared her reaction more than they cared for her life. The dropship doors sealed shut as explosions lit the horizon, and as they rose into the smoke-filled sky, Sailory whispered again, her voice soft as a trembling star. telling him that the resonance had marked him, that the law would brand him a criminal, that the entire empire would hunt him now. Evan looked at her, not with fear, but with a steady calm that silenced her trembling, because he had already decided something the moment he lifted her from the rubble. He would face whatever law, whatever danger, whatever fate came next, but he would not leave her behind, not now, not ever. The dropship shook as it climbed through the smoky sky, every panel rattling under the force of enemy artillery. Evan stood near the medbay door with Salieri still in his arms, feeling her breath rise and fall in weak, uneven waves, the glowing glyphs along her skin flickering like a fading constellation, fighting to stay lit. Alarms echoed across the cabin as the pilot called out warnings. But Evan barely heard anything except the quiet tremor in Salieri's voice as she whispered that the resonance was growing stronger, that her body was responding to the human scent around her, a reaction so rare and forbidden that even speaking of it could lead to exile or worse in her empire. He carried her gently into the medbay and set her on the diagnostic cradle as the doors hissed closed, white lights unfolding above them like metallic petals. Human medtech officers rushed in, their hands moving with calm precision as they scanned her glowing skin and rising temperature. Strange readings spread across the monitors showing neural surges, chemical shifts, and elevated heart patterns that had no match in their database. Salieri tried to speak, but her voice trembled too much. Evan knelt beside her and steadied her hand, feeling the faint electric warmth of the glyphs pulse against his glove. It wasn't painful, it wasn't hostile. It was something ancient, something instinctive, and something that terrified her more than any battlefield ever had. The senior medic frowned at the readings, explaining that the reaction wasn't harmful and wasn't caused by injury or infection. It was biological, natural even, just incredibly rare, something tied to evolutionary coding her people never shared publicly. Evan looked at Salieri and saw both relief and fear in her crystal eyes. She whispered that humans had a stable scent pattern because they did not have mating seasons or biological cycles the way many species did, that this alone could trigger an unpredictable response in certain Lyrans, especially those with royal genetic lines. But the law gave no space for understanding or science. It saw reaction as corruption, a sign that the outsider had breached purity, a crime punished without trial. Before Evan could respond, the ship rocked violently as Lyran hunters locked onto them, their sleek black vessels streaking through the atmosphere like falling stars with sharp wings. The pilot shouted that a gravity snare was being deployed, a net of collapsing energy meant to drag them back down for interrogation or execution. Evan moved toward the control deck, gripping railings as the ship lurched. Salieri's voice called out softly behind him, telling him the hunters would never let them reach neutral space, that returning her would not save him now. The law had already marked him guilty the moment her glyphs lit in his arms. He turned back and met her gaze, seeing not just fear but a silent plea for strength, a plea she did not want to speak out loud. He promised her they would get through this, not with pride or rebellion, but with survival, with calm, with courage, with truth. She closed her eyes for a moment, trusting him in a way no alien princess should trust a human soldier. The ship dove sharply as the pilot initiated an evasive descent into the scrapyard orbiting the moon below. Towers of dead starships floated like giant skeletons, fields of shattered metal glinting with old battles and silent histories, the perfect maze to hide in if they survived long enough to reach it. Gravity shifted as the dropship plunged between broken hulls and spinning debris, sparks flashing against the windows as fragments of old warships scraped the shields. Behind them, the hunters launched tracking flares, bright red trails that carved the darkness like bloody comets. Evan strapped himself in beside the co-pilot, calling out adjustments, coordinating with the pilot as they weaved through the maze of steel giants. A sharp alarm blared as the gravity snare activated, a web of collapsing force reaching toward them like invisible claws. The pilot cursed as the ship tilted sharply to avoid being crushed into the skeletal remains of a cruiser. In the medbay, Salieri felt the shift and gripped the sides of the cradle, her glyphs glowing brighter in panic, the reaction intensifying under stress. Evan rushed back to her, steadying her shoulders as the ship shuddered violently. She whispered that the hunters were broadcasting accusations already, calling him a defiler, calling her compromised, calling for purification protocol the moment she was retrieved. Evan felt anger rise inside him, not for himself but for her, for how quickly her people would turn a biological truth into a weapon, how little compassion or logic mattered when ancient laws ruled with fear and tradition. Another blast shook the ship, knocking the medbed sideways. Evan caught her before she fell, holding her close as the lights flickered overhead. She looked up at him through strands of silver hair falling across her face, and for a moment the chaos around them faded, replaced by something quiet, something fragile, something deeply human despite not being human at all. She whispered that she didn't want the law to decide her fate without understanding. She didn't want fear to erase the truth of what happened. She didn't want him hurt because he reached out his hand to save her life. The ship dived again as the pilot shouted that they had one chance left. A dangerous atmospheric dive through the scrapyard's lower ring where gravity fluctuated, and metal storms drifted like living clouds. Evan secured Sailiri into the emergency restraints as the hull groaned around them, the temperature dropping as they entered the unstable zone, the world outside turning into streaks of blue fire and spinning wreckage. Sailiri closed her eyes, whispering that the next moments would decide everything, whether they escaped, whether they lived, whether the resonance would be seen as truth or crime. Evan tightened the straps, brushing a strand of hair from her face with a gentle, steady motion, telling her she wasn't alone, telling her he wasn't afraid, telling her he would protect her no matter what came next. The ship tilted sharply as the pilot initiated the dive, metal screaming, engines roaring, hunters closing in, the world becoming one long falling breath. And in that breath, Evan held on to her with a strength that defied every law her empire had ever written. Because destiny had already chosen its path, and he was not stepping away from it now. Not in this storm. Not in this war. Not with her life in his hands. The desert moon stretched out beneath them like an endless sea of gold as the damaged dropship touched down with a heavy shudder. Wind sweeping across the barren dunes and carrying the soft hiss of sand against metal. Evan stepped out first to secure the landing zone, scanning the horizon where old embassies and abandoned research outposts lay half-buried under centuries of dust, forgotten by both humans and Lyrans. The perfect place to hide from eyes that searched the stars for them. Inside the ship, Sailiri tried to sit up, her glowing glyphs calmer now but still flickering in quiet pulses that revealed her exhaustion. Her fear and something else neither of them fully understood, something that tied itself to the air whenever she looked at him. Evan moved back inside and helped her down the ramp, his arms steady around her shoulders, her weight soft against him as she leaned into his strength. The desert wind wrapped around them like a warm whisper, carrying the scent of old stone and sun-baked ruins. Sailori's eyes moved slowly across the landscape, taking in the empty watchtowers and crumbling walls of what once was a place of peace between their species. She whispered that her ancestors had signed treaties here, agreements of science and knowledge before the regent twisted the laws to build walls instead of bridges. And for a fleeting moment she looked like someone mourning a home she had never truly known. They reached the safe house nestled between two collapsed towers, a low stone building half swallowed by drifting dunes, its doors sealed by old diplomatic codes that no one had bothered to erase. Evan keyed in the universal override provided by their Alliance archives. The lock responded with a tired hum as if it had been waiting years for someone to open it again. The inside smelled like old metal and dust, but it was safe, quiet, and shielded from scanners. He guided Sailori to a reclining bench and activated the power cells. Lights flickering on one by one like faint stars returning after a long eclipse. Sailori lay back and closed her eyes as the glow of her glyphs softened. Evan adjusted a thermal blanket around her shoulders, careful not to touch her bare skin more than he had to, even though every time he did the glyphs warmed again with a pulse of golden light. She noticed his restraint and smiled faintly, telling him he didn't need to fear the reaction as long as she remained calm. Human stability eased the surges. Her body was simply responding to something it had never encountered before. Something rare, something ancient, something she had been taught to fear without ever being allowed to understand it. He asked her softly what the resonance truly meant, and she hesitated before answering, her voice trembling with the weight of words she had never spoken to an outsider. She explained that for her people, the resonance was old as the first star myths, a sign meant to guide alliances and royal bonds, a biological whisper that revealed compatibility deeper than politics or power. But over centuries, the law had reshaped it into a tool of control, forbidding it with outsiders, condemning it as corruption, turning a natural truth into something shameful, something dangerous, something to hide or destroy. And now it lived inside her in a way she could no longer deny. Evan listened with steady patience, the quiet hum of the safe house filling the space between them as the desert wind howled against the walls. He didn't interrupt, didn't judge, didn't pull away. He simply let her speak until her breath softened and her eyes drifted down. She looked at her glowing hands and whispered that she didn't understand why it happened with him, why her body recognized a human when the law insisted it was impossible. Why destiny had chosen the one path her people would never accept. She asked him if he regretted saving her, if he wished he had not touched her, if he wished she had stayed buried under the rubble instead of becoming his burden. Evan shook his head with a calm that wrapped around her like a shield, telling her he didn't regret a single breath of what happened, telling her that saving her was not a mistake, telling her that whatever this resonance was, he would not abandon her to fear or law or punishment. Sailory's eyes filled with quiet emotion at his words, her chest rising with a deep trembling breath, as if those simple promises reached a part of her heart she had kept locked behind duty her entire life. For a moment the safe house felt less like a hiding place and more like a sanctuary, a fragile space where truth could breathe without chains. Their quiet moment broke when Evan's comlink buzzed with a coded ping from the relay tower outside. He tapped the screen and saw a message from his squad, the words sharp and urgent. The Regent had issued a new decree declaring Sailory compromised by human influence, declaring Evan a violator of royal purity, declaring the Resonance a threat to the Empire, and demanding immediate capture or termination of both of them. Sailory's face drained of color as she read the translation, her hands shaking as she whispered that the Regent would twist the law to make an example of them, that he feared the truth of the Resonance more than any war, that he would destroy anything that challenged his control. Evan told her they would find a way to fight the lies, not through violence but by showing the truth to the Star Council, the only authority above the Regent. He explained that the Council valued science and evidence, that they could protect her if they reached them in time. Sailory nodded, but her eyes still trembled with uncertainty. She knew the Regent would not let them escape so easily. He would send sentinels, hunters trained to capture without mercy, warriors who followed the law like breath. Evan promised her they would leave before the trackers reached the moon. But even as he spoke, the ground outside began to vibrate with distant engines, the kind that belonged only to elite Lyran forces. Sailory looked toward the sealed door as the vibration grew stronger, her golden glyphs brightening again with fear. Evan moved to the window and saw shadows moving across the dunes, sleek figures advancing with silent precision, their armor glinting softly under the fading sunlight. The sentinels had found them. Sailory whispered his name, her voice soft and shaking, and Evan turned toward her with a calm burning inside him, a calm forged not from fear but from resolve. He walked to her side and took her trembling hand, steadying her with a warm grip that made the glyphs glow brighter but gentler. He told her they were not losing this fight, not to fear, not to law, not to destiny twisted by someone else's hand. The shadows outside grew closer, the wind rising like a warning, the safe house trembling under the march of armored feet. Evan stood between Sailory and the door as the first sentinel approached, and the story that began with a rescue in the rubble now stepped into a moment that would shape the fate of two worlds, and neither of them would run from it, not now, not ever. The first shockwave hit the safe house like a giant fist, shaking sand loose from the ceiling and sending a low rumble through the floor as the sentinels closed in, with perfect silent precision. Evan positioned himself between Sailory and the door, his pulse steady even as the walls trembled with each advancing footstep. Outside, the sun dipped behind the dunes, bathing the world in deep gold and shadow, the kind of light that made every shape look sharper, every danger feel closer. Sailory gripped the edge of the bench as the glow along her skin flared again, her body reacting to fear and tension, the shifting glyphs painting soft golden reflections across the dim room. And when she whispered his name, it carried the trembling weight of someone who knew that the next minutes could decide the fate of her future, her life and their last chance at truth. The door shook as the first sentinel activated a sonic breach tool, the stone vibrating under its hum like a living creature trying to escape its own skin. Evan took a slow breath, lifted his rifle, and glanced back at Sailory. She nodded, her eyes full of courage she had never needed to show in front of her own people, courage that grew stronger every time she looked at him. The sonic tool intensified until the hinges groaned. Then with a final crack, the door burst inward, dust exploding in a wide cloud as three armored figures entered, their white plates reflecting the fading light like polished bone, glyph-coated visors sweeping the room in silent judgment. Evan fired first, not to kill but to disrupt, using stun rounds that sparked against their chest plates and forced them back a step. The sentinels advanced anyway, moving with the steady, unshakable rhythm of soldiers trained from childhood to obey the law without hesitation. Sailory raised her trembling hands and activated a sonic override she had discovered in old treaty records, a harmless frequency designed to disable royal armor systems in emergencies. Her voice shook as she triggered the pulse, and the air trembled with an invisible wave that flowed across the room like rippling heat. The sentinels froze mid-step, their armor locks flashing red as internal systems powered down. One fell to a knee, another staggered backward. The third drew a blade to manually continue the mission even without functioning armor. Evan moved fast, intercepting the blade with his forearm guard and knocking the sentinel off balance. The clash echoed through the small room, metal scraping metal as sparks danced across the stone floor. The sentinel swung again with cold precision, but Evan stepped in close, grabbed his shoulder plate, and pushed him back with a force that sent him crashing into the wall. Sailory's override pulsed again, this time stronger, and the final sentinel dropped his blade as his suit fully locked into emergency shutdown. The room fell quiet except for Sailory's ragged breathing, and the low hum of the override fading into silence. Evan rushed to her side immediately, seeing the strain the pulse had put on her, her glyphs flickering like dying firelight. He steadied her shoulders, whispering reassurance until her breath softened. She tried to smile through her exhaustion, telling him the override was old, unstable, something she had read only in forgotten treaty lines, something no one had used in centuries. Evan looked into her eyes and told her she had just saved both of them, her bravery shining brighter than any glyph on her skin, her heart steadier than any law that tried to cage her. But their victory was brief, because even as the sentinels lay immobilized, Evan noticed a small blinking shard attached to the doorframe, a tracker planted during the breach, sending their exact coordinates to the Lyran cruiser hiding beyond the dunes. Sailory's breath caught when she recognized the signature. It belonged to her captain, a loyal officer bound by duty to retrieve her, someone she trusted once but who now followed the Regent's twisted commands with blind devotion. Evan looked outside and saw shadows moving on the ridge, more soldiers advancing, the safe house no longer a refuge but a trap tightening around them. He grabbed Sailory's hand and guided her to the back entrance. Moving quickly through a narrow corridor that smelled of sand and old metal, the outside world opened to a slope leading toward the towering sand structures known as the spiral towers. Ancient formations shaped by wind and time, sharp ridges rising like the spines of giant buried beasts. They ran down the slope, Sailory leaning on him as her strength wavered, the moonlight casting long shadows that stretched across the desert like reaching hands. Behind them, bootsteps pounded against the dunes, voices calling out commands, the pursuit growing closer with every breath. Evan fired a flare into the air, its light bursting like a miniature sun, and the metallic towers reflected it in scattered shards that blinded the approaching sentinels for precious seconds. He used the distraction to guide Sailory between the tallest ridges, the sand shifting under their feet as gusts of warm wind curled around them. Sailory whispered that her captain wasn't seeking to capture her safely. He was under strict orders to return her to the Regent by any means necessary, even if it meant forcing her into silence before she could reach the Star Council with the truth. The thought struck her like a blade, and she staggered, but Evan caught her before she fell, lifting her into his arms as easily as he had in the ruined outpost. She rested her head against his shoulder, her glyphs warming with a soft golden glow that reflected off the sand. She whispered that she trusted him more than anyone now, that she believed he would protect her even when her own people turned their backs. And he answered without hesitation that he would, that nothing in this desert or in the stars would take her from him. They reached the far side of the spiral towers, where a narrow canyon opened toward the landing ridge. Evan's squad would be arriving soon with emergency extraction, but only if they held out long enough. He set Sailory down gently behind a stone outcrop and faced the canyon's mouth, weapon raised, stance unshaken. Ready for whatever came next, Sailory watched him, feeling something deep within her steady itself at the sight of him standing against the storm alone. Not because he was ordered to, not because he sought glory, but because he chose her. He chose her every step of the way. The wind howled louder as sentinels appeared at the canyon entrance, their silhouettes sharp against the rising moon. Evan tightened his grip on his rifle as Sailory's glyphs flared once more, their shared breath filling the desert with a quiet, fierce determination. The Battle of the Sand Towers was about to begin, and it would not be a battle of power or weapons alone. It would be a battle of truth, of loyalty, of a bond forbidden by law but stronger than fear, stronger than fate, stronger than the desert night closing around them. The canyon stared back at them like a giant open mouth waiting to swallow everything they loved, the wind rising in long, lonely breaths as sentinels stepped into view, their armor glowing faintly under the moonlight like pale ghosts of a law that refused to bend. Evan stood in front of Celeri with steady resolve, every part of his body ready for the storm that was coming, but deep inside his chest a quiet worry pulsed for her, because he could feel how fragile her breath had become, how the resonance pulled at her strength every time fear brushed her heart. Her golden glyphs flickering in uneven waves that revealed more than she ever spoke aloud. The first sentinel moved forward with smooth mechanical precision, his voice calm and cold as he declared Celeri compromised, declared Evan a corrupter, declared that royal law demanded she be returned for immediate judgment. Evan raised his weapon but said nothing, his silence louder than any argument, his stance a promise that they would not surrender. Not now. Not after everything they had survived. Celeri stepped closer to him, her trembling hand brushing his arm, the contact making her glyphs flare gently like soft firelight as she whispered that she wanted to speak to her captain, to reason with him, to find even the smallest piece of mercy left in the man who once taught her honor. Her voice carried across the canyon like a fragile call, and her captain stepped forward from the shadows, tall and rigid in ceremonial armor, his face hidden but his tone heavy with disappointment as he told her she had dishonored her throne, dishonored her blood, dishonored every ancient law by allowing a human to touch her. His words cut across the air like cold metal, and Celeri winced as though each one struck the deepest part of her heart. Evan felt anger rise inside him, not sharp and reckless, but deep and protective, a fierce calm that settled into every breath he took. Celeri lifted her chin with slow, steady courage, telling her captain that law meant nothing without truth, that the resonance was real and natural and not a crime, that her body responded because their science had never cared to understand human biology. She explained that humans had no mating seasons, no timed cycles, no chemical shifts that bent their emotions. Their scent stayed steady across every hour, and that stability awakened something her people had forgotten, something buried in their evolution, something meant to guide unity, not punishment. Her captain refused to listen. Raising his weapon and ordering his soldiers to take her by force, Evan stepped in front of her instantly, blocking the path with his entire frame as the wind swirled around them in a rising storm. The sentinels advanced, but Evan did not step back. He fired warning shots that sparked against their armor, the sound echoing through the canyon like thunder, the sand trembling under the pressure of each impact. Celeri's breath quickened, her glyphs brightening with fear until she placed a hand on his back, her voice soft yet steady as she begged him not to hurt her own people. Evan lowered his rifle but did not move aside, and the brief moment of quiet that followed felt like the entire desert was holding its breath. Celeri walked past him with slow, measured steps, facing her. Captain with all the dignity of the air she truly was, the glyphs on her skin glowing like ancient symbols of forgotten royalty. She spoke again, not with fear but with strength, telling him the regent had lied, that he twisted the omen clause to serve his own power, that he wanted her silenced because her resonance with a human threatened the control he held over the empire. Her captain hesitated, doubt flickering through his posture. But before he could speak, a transmission crackled in the air, a hologram flickering to life above the canyon floor, the regent himself appearing in cold, shimmering blue light, his voice dripping with contempt as he accused Celeri of falling to human corruption, accused Evan of manipulating her, accused them both of destroying the honor of the throne. He commanded the sentinels to capture her alive and bring the human back in chains or pieces. Whichever was easier, the captain stiffened at the command, torn between loyalty and conscience, but the regent's orders pulled stronger. Dragging him back into blind obedience, Evan saw the shift and knew the window for peace had closed. The captain raised his hand and the sentinels surged forward again, their blades flashing under the moonlight. Evan pulled Celeri behind him and fired a burst of suppressing rounds that lit the canyon in sharp sparks. Celeri activated her sonic override once more, her body trembling with the effort, her voice cracking as the pulse rippled out in a wide, invisible wave, disabling several sentinel suits but pushing her to the edge of collapse. She swayed on her feet, her breath shallow, her glyphs flickering like an exhausted flame struggling to stay alive. Evan caught her before she fell, pulling her against his chest as he fired again at the advancing soldiers, every breath he took filled with the desperate need to keep her safe. His comlink buzzed with a message from his squad. They were minutes away, approaching fast from the western ridge, but minutes felt like an eternity when an army was closing in. The captain stepped forward again, raising his blade for a final advance. But a sudden roar cut through the canyon as human dropcraft engines echoed overhead, spotlights slicing through the dark as Evan's squad swept in with precision fire. The Sentinels retreated under the sudden barrage, their formation breaking as the human team descended with ropes and shields. Providing cover for evacuation, Evan lifted Sailori carefully into his arms, her head resting weakly against his shoulder, her glyphs faint but still glowing, still alive, still fighting. He carried her toward the waiting craft as the wind rose behind them, carrying the cries of soldiers still torn between law and truth, still blinded by fear wrapped in tradition. Sailori opened her eyes one last time before slipping into exhaustion, whispering that the council must hear the truth, that only they could save their future. Evan held her tighter as the craft lifted into the night sky, the canyon fading beneath them, the war shifting above them, the truth waiting ahead of them like a fragile star they could not afford to lose. And in that rising darkness he swore he would bring her there no matter the cost, no matter the empire, no matter the danger that followed them like a shadow across the stars, because this was more than destiny now. This was a promise he carried in his heart like a blazing light, a promise he would not break, not now, not ever. The council station hung in orbit like a silent crown of silver light as the human dropcraft approached, its massive rings glowing against the endless dark. But inside the craft the world felt much smaller, filled only with the shallow breaths of Sailori resting against Evan's chest as he carried her toward the medwing, her golden glyphs dim but still alive, still pulsing with that ancient rhythm that tied her fate to his. The human squad moved ahead, clearing the corridors, guiding them through the polished halls where diplomats once debated peace. But now every shadow felt heavy with danger, because both of them knew the Regent would not let them reach the council without one final strike. The med team gently took Sailori from Evan's arms, placing her on a crystalline stretcher as shimmering panels scanned her trembling form, and he stood beside her, refusing to step back even when doctors told him to rest, his jaw tight with worry, his eyes fixed on every flicker of her glowing skin. The lead physician glanced up and explained in a soft voice that the resonance had drained her energy through emotional and physical stress, that the battlefield pulse she used had pushed her body beyond its limit. She would recover, but she needed time. Time they did not have, because the Regent's forces would arrive soon and he would twist any weakness she showed into another lie. Evan stayed by her side as she slept, his hand wrapped around hers with a gentle, steady grip, feeling the faint warmth of her glyphs against his skin, the quiet beep of the monitors mixing with the distant hum of the station's engines. Hours passed like slow drifting stars until the light suddenly dimmed and a loud alarm cut through the halls, shaking the walls with its warning pulse. The human commander rushed into the medroom and shouted that a fleet had arrived without authorization. Pirate vessels flying false flags but with Lyran energy signatures hidden beneath their hulls. The Regent's mercenaries had come to stage an attack and blame humans for igniting a civil conflict. Evan felt a cold stillness spread through his chest as the truth settled in. This was the Regent's last move, a desperate attempt to destroy any chance Sailori had to speak, any chance the Council had to hear the truth, any chance that science and understanding could stand against fear and law. He looked down at Sailori as her eyes fluttered open at the sound of the alarms, her breath catching weakly as she whispered his name, asking what was happening. He leaned close and explained in a steady voice that danger had come again, but this time they would face it together. The fear in her eyes softened when she saw his resolve, her hand tightening around his as if holding on to the one constant that had never failed her. The assault hit the outer ring first, explosions lighting the windows like falling stars as the station shuddered under the impact. The commander ordered all non-combatants to shelter zones, but Evan refused to leave Sailori's side. He lifted her gently and carried her through the corridors as the squad escorted them toward the protected council chamber. The halls echoed with distant gunfire and the crackling roar of breached bulkheads. Every step a fight against time. Every turn another reminder of how much danger wrapped itself around their fate. When they reached the chamber doors, the attack intensified. Mercenaries cutting through security barriers with plasma blades. Evan handed Sailori to a medic for a moment and moved toward the front line with his squad, his heart heavy but his purpose unshakable. He fought with the controlled precision that humans were known for. Swift movements, clear strategy, protecting the civilians behind him with every strike. Sailori watched him with wide, trembling eyes, her chest rising with emotion as she saw how he fought not for power, not for glory, but for her, for them, for the fragile truth they shared. The mercenaries kept advancing more than expected, their weapons burning through metal like it was paper. Sailori knew exactly what the Regent wanted. He wanted chaos. He wanted Lyran soldiers to blame humans. He wanted the Council to see only violence and fear. She knew what she had to do, even if it terrified her. She removed her filtration mask and stepped forward, her breath trembling but her eyes shining with quiet strength. She reached deep into her training, into the meditative techniques Evan had taught her during the safe house nights. Slow breathing, steady focus, calm heart, and her glyphs began to glow stronger. Brighter, steadier than they ever had before. The mercenaries saw the glow and hesitated, their aggression faltering as Saleeri raised her voice and called out an ancient command used only by royal heirs. A tone shaped by ancestry and coded in their biology, it resonated through the hall like a living pulse, calming Lyran nerves, weakening the synthetic pheromone the regent released into the air to push Lyrans into frenzy. She countered it with her own natural signal, her glyphs burning like gold fire across her skin. Evan turned toward her in awe, watching her stand against the storm with nothing but breath and courage and the strength of her bloodline. The mercenaries faltered, losing their coordination, and Evan used the opening to push forward, sealing bulkheads and cutting their access routes, securing the chamber one hallway at a time. Saleeri's glow slowly dimmed as exhaustion pulled at her again, her body trembling from the effort. Evan rushed back to her and caught her before she collapsed, holding her close as alarms faded, and the commander's voice echoed through the hall announcing that the remaining mercenaries had surrendered. The regent's plan had failed. The evidence logs had been captured. The truth of the attack would be shown to the council. Saleeri pressed her forehead softly against Evan's chest, whispering that she feared what the council would say, what judgment they would pass on the resonance, what future awaited them, and Evan held her tighter, telling her that whatever happened he would face it with her, that nothing in the stars could make him step away now, that the truth was strong enough to carry them further than fear ever could. She closed her eyes at his words, her heart steadying against his heartbeat, and for the first time since the outpost she allowed herself to believe that they might survive this. Lights brightened as the chamber doors opened and council guards stepped inside to escort them to the stand where verdicts were shaped. Saleeri leaned into Evan with quiet trust, her voice barely a whisper as she said she was ready. Ready for truth, ready for judgment, ready for fate. And Evan walked beside her with unwavering strength, knowing that whatever the council decided, whatever the empire demanded, whatever the future held, he would not leave her side, not now, not ever. The council chamber rose around them like a cathedral carved from starlight, its towering pillars glowing with soft blue energy, as if the walls themselves were listening, waiting, judging. Evan walked beside Saleeri with steady steps, her hand resting lightly on his arm, her strength returning in delicate waves as the golden glow along her skin flickered with quiet resolve. Every eye in the chamber followed them as they approached the central platform, ambassadors whispering behind masked expressions, guards shifting with nervous tension, the entire room alive with the weight of a decision that would ripple across galaxies. Saleeri took a slow, trembling breath and stepped forward, her voice soft but carrying through the silent hall as she declared her identity, declared her survival, declared her right to speak. The council high chair watched her with ancient eyes, then nodded with solemn respect, inviting her to share her truth. She lifted her chin and spoke of the outpost, the collapse, the rescue, the moment Evan carried her from the rubble, her voice steady even when emotion tugged at her throat. She explained the resonance as her ancestors once understood it, a natural biological sign buried in royal bloodlines, something meant to connect hearts and civilizations, not ignite fear and judgment. She told the council how the regent twisted those laws, how he blinded her people with lies, how he weaponized a biological truth to maintain control, how he sent hunters to silence her and mercenaries to frame the human alliance. Her glow brightened as she spoke, every word a spark striking the cold armor of tradition. Evan watched her with awe, feeling the quiet strength in her voice grow like rising dawn, feeling the truth she carried burn through centuries of buried fear. And when she spoke his name, it was with a softness that filled the chamber with trembling emotion. She told them he saved her not because of politics or law, but because he could not turn away from a life in danger. The high chair turned to Evan then, asking him if he wished to speak, and he stepped forward with calm, unshakable resolve. He explained the rescue with simple honesty, each moment clear and real, no embellishments, no excuses, just the truth of a soldier who saw someone in need and acted. He described the hunters, the battles, the safe house, the canyon fight, the mercenary attack, the desperation, the fear, and the hope that kept them alive when everything else pushed them toward death. He spoke of Saleeri with respect woven through every word, not as a princess, not as a symbol, but as a person, someone brave and brilliant and undeserving of the lies thrown at her. Council members murmured as evidence from the mercenary ships flickered into holographic view. Logs showing the Regent's payments, recordings of forged transmissions, data trails that painted the truth clearer than any speech could. The chamber filled with rising shock, disbelief, and anger as the Council realized the scale of the betrayal. Saleri felt her chest tighten as she watched her people's corruption uncovered before the galaxy. But Evan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, grounding her with the quiet, steady presence she had come to trust more than her own breath. The Council withdrew to deliberate, leaving Evan and Saleri standing together in the center of the silent chamber. The air thick with tension as minutes stretched like hours. Saleri leaned against him, exhaustion pulling at her while fear tugged at her heart, whispering questions she wasn't ready to ask. She wondered if they would denounce her, if they would exile him, if they would force them apart because the galaxy was not ready to accept a bond that defied every law written on stone and starlight. Evan wrapped an arm around her gently and whispered that whatever the decision was, he would not leave her, not even if the entire empire commanded it. The doors opened suddenly and the Council filed in with solemn expressions. Every heartbeat in the chamber tightened as the high chair raised their hand for silence. The verdict came in a voice calm and ancient, declaring the Regent guilty of treason, declaring his laws void, declaring the original Omen Clause restored. The chamber erupted in surprise as the Council announced a new decree, one that redefined the resonance as a phenomenon of scientific importance, not shame, not corruption, not crime. They ordered joint human-Lyran research to understand cross-species biological responses, to protect those affected, to ensure no one would ever be judged for a natural truth written into their blood. Saleri's breath broke into a soft gasp as the high chair turned to her with warm respect, declaring her innocence, her bravery, her right to choose her own future. Then they turned to Evan, stating clearly that he was cleared of all charges, that his actions were heroic, that he would be honored as a liaison if he chose to serve at Saleri's side. Silence flooded the chamber for a long, trembling moment before relief washed over Saleri's face, tears gathering in the corners of her shining eyes as she turned to Evan with a soft, hopeful smile. A smile shaped by destiny and courage and a bond stronger than any law that tried to break it. The Council dismissed them to rest, and Evan guided Saleri out of the chamber slowly, the hallway glowing with gentle blue lights, every step quiet and intimate in the aftermath of the storm. Outside a viewing window, the stars stretched across the dark like glowing threads of fate. Saleri stopped and placed her hand against the glass, her reflection shimmering beside his, her golden glyphs glowing softly as she whispered that the future felt both terrifying and beautiful, that she didn't know what came next, that she was afraid of choosing wrong but more afraid of choosing without him. Evan stepped closer, his voice low and steady as he told her she didn't have to choose alone, that he would walk beside her wherever destiny led, that their bond was not a mistake or a crime but a truth forged through fire and survival and trust. Saleri turned to him slowly, her heart beating in soft trembling waves, her glyphs blooming with a warmth brighter than they had ever glowed before. She whispered that she believed him, that she trusted him, that she wanted to build whatever came next together, even if the stars trembled at their steps. And as the Council station drifted across the darkness, Evan and Saleri stood side by side, two lives intertwined by fate and war and a truth older than any law, knowing that the hardest battles were behind them and the most beautiful battles lay ahead, knowing their bond had survived every test written in the stars, knowing that whatever future waited for them they would face it together, not with fear, not with doubt, but with a courage that rose like dawn across the endless night. Not now, not ever.